Hi folks, David Jameson here, editor at contour.co.uk, and I just want to speak to you today with a couple of guests about ongoing events in France related to Islamophobia, new rules and laws and regulations that are being mooted in France, a crackdown really on the Muslim community in that country, because I think it forms part of a wider and very important discussion about Islamophobia across the West, the way states are using it, and the current political juncture and crisis. I'm very glad to be joined today by Emre Ungun, who is an activist and socialist and writer based in France. He's a member of Attack France, and has written widely on this subject. And Jonah Butch, a contributing editor at Jacobin and sociologist, who likewise has a degree of expertise and familiarity with the subjects that we're about to discuss. Thanks very much, folks, for coming on today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So to give people a bit of background on this, because it's hard to say how much in Britain, for example, or in the United States, people are keeping up with these events. Obviously, people will have heard that there's been a series of attacks in France, apparently with an Islamist so-called motivation. This has led to a response from the French state, not certainly without precedent in French history. This has been a recurring theme in French state policy, a widespread crackdown against the civil liberties, in particular of Muslims, a ramping up of suspicion against the Muslim community, and now an unprecedented charter which Muslim community leaders have been told they must sign up to, a charter of Republican values, so-called. And this charter it does a few things, including curbing specifically political expression within the Muslim community. Emre, could you just fill us in on the character of this maneuver by the French state and what it's trying to achieve?
Thank you, David. I think that in a global way, we are now living in those weeks a kind of French Patriot Act. It's really comparable with what happened in the U.S. in after 2000, after the World Trade Center bombings. What's happening in France since 5 years, since the attacks that happened 5 years ago. That's a kind of a slow motion 9/11 that's France is going through, because it's not one big, very spectacular and murderous attack. There are few different murders, mass murders, or individual murders, horrific murders committed by different people. But anyway, those lead to this kind of French Patriot Act, which is not one act, but different acts or bills that are proposed to the parliament. And about what you asked, there is this major bill which first was called the bill against separatism. Now, which has changed its name to be called to reinforce the principles of the Republic and secularism. Basically, it puts under control the political life of Muslims. That's the aim. It cannot be written like that in the law, of course, but that's the aim. How does it will it function? What are the propositions? It's mostly to have that the state representatives state representatives control associations. And of course, we know that their control will focus on Muslim associations and will put them in jeopardy. It's already the case. We can discuss about it later, but it will, this legal situation will be even harder for these associations, particularly. The charter for any kind of public subsidy for like the state or local governments to give money to these associations, they will have to accept a charter about republic. And it's not only the associations, it's also Muslims as individuals. There is one particular thing in France, it's the principle of the neutrality of public servants, okay? So a teacher in a public school cannot wear any religious item in her job, in his or her job. And I said her because it aims mostly the hijab. But it has been extended 15 years ago to the students in the school, which is something very new. Maybe Jonah can talk about this later. But now in this bill, there's also the idea to apply this neutrality for the contractors of public services. You see, for any structure that gives public service, but they are, even if people working there are not public servants. For example, if there is an association, if there is a private structure that is a kindergarten, now the woman working in this kindergarten will be submitted to the neutrality of public servants, which was not the case. So those are the about this law, those are about this bill, those are the most striking aspects. But there's a general political context that is helping Islamophobia broadly.
Well, one thing to understand about France that's very different than the United States is that different groups, on the one hand, there is this notion of kind of the Republican unity of, all citizens, we don't differentiate. On the other hand, groups are organized vertically, and the state already recognizes like official organizations that are officially recognized to represent and speak for different groups of people. So for example, there are organizations that represent Muslims in France, to the state, within the state, essentially. And in large part, that is a way for the state to kind of keep control over, over these organizations. And this really strengthens, they exist for other groups too. So for example, there are official bodies representing French Jews, something that in the United States just, it doesn't exist, right? So that's a little bit different there. And this really strengthens it. Emre, my understanding is, for example, like now religious clerics would have to be approved, right? By, they would have to be, their names would have to be submitted and they would have to be approved. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's something which is very, an issue with which the French state is very uncomfortable. As you said, there are national representatives of major confessions, including Jews. And there's, as you said, a body supposedly representing the Muslims. And it's a body that was, it's a body that was created by the state. It's not something, it's not a creation by the Muslims in France who decided to have a national body that represent them, all of them. No, it was the state who wanted to have someone talking for the Muslims, and so invented and created this body. But in the same time, this body, unlike other representative religious institutions, is not that legitimate. That's a problem, and it doesn't function very well. And as you say, the issue of the imams is very of the clerics is very important and difficult to resolve for France. And in fact, and for this, Macron is not stupid, because in his bill he put some propositions which are not absurd, which make sense. One of them is that we can't have clerics which are from other states, which are funded by other states, which is the case now. For example, the Turkish state funds, sends imams from Turkey and in France who are in charge, and those people are from the head of the Turkish religious affairs, which is a war machine for the regime. Okay, and so it's true that it can't go like this. That's a fact. But by saying that, which is something true, he also, in the same movement, he aims to put, as you said, the clerics, Muslim clerics, under a kind of control and to have their legitimization by the French state, which is something very tricky. It's not secularism, it's the control of religious bodies by the state.
I wanted to come in on this because it is a very strange interpretation of, because when you hear a debate on this question, you often hear people arguing an abstract version of laissez-faire, so-called, French attitude towards secularism, against an interpretation of what Islamism would be. These aren't abstractions. The French system of secularism, so-called, is, as you said, it's a direct state interference in the religious life of the communities of the nation, and it's highly politicized. There's a political interpretation of what correct Islamic teachings are and what incorrect Islamic teachings are. But also this part of the Charter of Republican Values says that Islam has to be a religion and not be political. Yeah. As though religion and politics have ever been separated. Any religion and any politics has ever been separated. It's an impossible thing to achieve. Could this be read to mean, for example, that if there was another war by the French state in a majority Muslim country, it couldn't be said in mosques that this war was wrong? The implications of that are very far-reaching and very, very authoritarian. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, you are right to point this out, and the fact is that it will go, as you said. I can't answer to your question because with a very sure, I can't say it will be like that, but what you say is probable, and I can guess what will be said in the situation that you described. It will be said that if there is any cleric, Muslim cleric, saying that this war is wrong, it will be considered as there is a magic word in the French political language, mainstream political language, which is communautarism. Communautarism is the magic word of the French secular bourgeoisie. Basically, it means that any oppressed group expressing their concerns as an oppressed group is communautarism and dividing the beautiful unity of the French Republic. And that's a word which is used by the right, of course, but also by center left, by the extreme right, by everyone. And it disqualifies any kind of radical or politically active oppressed groups, organization, and discourse. And that's what will happen if a Muslim cleric says in war, about war in which the French state is in against a Muslim country. If you say something against it, it will be called communitarism, 100%.
I mean, just to say the language of communitarianism, anti-separatism, this real, the framing of terrorism and the war on terror, in terms of the dangers of political Islam and Islamism, and that's a framing. Emre's right that both centrists in France, and many people who we would consider liberals here, in the Anglophone world, and the far right both share. I mean, Marine Le Pen will talk about the dangers of communitarianism, and argue that it's an assault on the Republican values, and so will people in Macron's party, and and in the government. So it's something that unites people, and that framing of things.
I want to talk about that relationship between the center and the far right, but just one last point on the framing of Islamophobia in France, the language of which I agree is interesting and dangerous. So this phrase that you see emerging from official circles in France of Muslim separatism, there's this attitude that it's the refusal of the Muslim population to integrate, and there's also a kind of this attitude put across that it's particularly conservative Muslims who want to hold to their own ideas and not integrate. But what we know about people attracted to the kind of ultra-violent Islamist, kind of nihilistic type ideology that was involved in things like Islamic State is the young men in particular who are drawn into these movements typically aren't part of mainstream Muslim life in their countries. They're not typically part of these sort of very structured or distinct Muslim communities or traditions. They're very often young men who've lived very chaotic, very isolated lives, often involving crime, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, these sorts of things. So it seems to me that there's a willful refusal to accept this idea that it's not simply a quote unquote communitarian problem. Young people who are drawn towards this ideology often come from, in some senses, a similar background to people who are drawn to the far right. Young men with very kind of disrupted lifestyles and so on. In any case, this relationship between the center and the far right. I mean, I remember a few years ago, and we've become quite familiar with these ideas now. I remember Mélenchon at the time when it was Macron and tragically Le Pen in the runoff in the presidential elections. There was a lot of weight put on the radical left to swing behind Macron as a form of anti-fascist kind of politics. And figures on the left like Jean-Luc Mélenchon said, no, I'm not going to tell my supporters who they should vote for as president, not obviously because he expected large numbers of left-wing voters to vote for Le Pen, but he wanted the left to maintain a degree of critical distance from the centre. My feeling is, and tell me if you think I'm wrong, but my feeling is that approach has been largely vindicated by subsequent events, because what you have is Macron not acting as an effective bloc to the far right, but actually ceding a huge amount of territory to the far right and helping to generate an atmosphere where a minority community in France is being blamed for the huge problems in French society. And lastly, it feels to me that this move from Macron is being done with things like the yellow vests in the back of his mind. He wants to reframe and redefine who the French political sphere, who the problems are and who the good guys are and so forth. Jonah, perhaps if you could come in on some of that stuff.
So I think that there are two ways of answering your question. There's the specific strategy of Macron around who tried to kind of reconfigure, remake French politics, and form his own party, which in a lot of ways has been a failure, and also present himself as the only alternative to Le Pen, someone who crosses ideological divides and it represents kind of the moderate center against the danger of the extreme right. And that certainly is something that he's tried to do. Actually, a very unpopular figure in France, or has been through most of his term, but might well, potentially win re-election in 2022 on that basis, as the anti-Le Pen candidate. That's and then on the other hand, there's a possibility the far right will actually come to power this time. Then there's the larger context around what you're saying, and there has been a dynamic where the far right since the 1980s has been able to feed off of, I would say, a series of pathologies in French politics, and certainly debates around Islam and Muslims and French national identity have really helped the far right. And that's not, something that's recent. The FN, the predecessor to the Marine Le Pen's party, founded by her father, made its big breakthrough in 1983-84 at the time of under Francois Mitterrand. And on the one hand, Mitterrand was kind of leading the government down this neoliberal turn. On the other hand, there was the beginnings of a kind of official anti-racism in France, right? I mean, there were big protests. Groups were founded, SOS Racisme, kind of establishment anti-racist liberal groups that were not effective at all in preventing Marine Le Pen from politicizing issues of immigration and identity to an extent that had not been true earlier. I mean, even at the peak of, Algerian labor migration to France in the 60s and the 70s, very few people cared about immigration very much as an issue. And it wasn't until the end of the 80s that it became, if you look at the opinion polls with French voters, that it became a central concern for voters. And at pretty much the same time, questions of, of religious identity and French, national identity and whether Muslims could be really integrated or whether they had to abandon their Muslimness became very integral to French politics. So the first big controversy around students wearing the headscarf in schools was in 1989, the first affaire de foulard, first headscarf affair. And in the 90s and the 2000s, that became more and more of a central concern as the far right was building up. And you see the way in which kind of mainstream politicians have attempted to undercut the far right by claiming some of those concerns around national identity and around the place of Muslims in France. And it's just contributed to the growth of this sentiment. I mean, Jacques Chirac, who was one of the, maybe the last French president who had retained any popularity at the end of his term, very famously gave a speech in 1990. It's called the smell and the noise speech. And he talked about how could, if you're just a French worker sitting at home, and now you have these immigrants moving in next door and the smell and the noise, how could you stand it? And he was clearly kind of trying to appeal to a kind of anti-immigrant far right sentiment. And then also Sarkozy, who was the president after, 2007, I think he was elected, tried to hold a big national debate on French identity that was clearly very much focused on this, on these issues around Muslims and whether they can integrate. And rather than undercutting the far right, I think it really set it up. Similarly, under Francois Hollande, I mean, his his prime minister, Manuel Valls, was often known for saying, people need to integrate, real crackdown on Roma, Sinti groups, but also on Muslims, and some real hard, like law and order rhetoric, and this rhetoric around integration. So you see the way in which there's been this dynamic that the far right has grown. These issues have become politicized around immigration, around cultural identity, around integration. The dangers of communitarianism has become kind of a staple of French political debate. And as mainstream politics have tried to claim those issues from the far right, it set them up further. And I think there's no way that that Macron certainly by doing this is going to block the far right's growth. Was that clear? Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah.
I think that first I would like just about the issue that we were talking first time for people to realize how far this will of the French state to control Muslim representation goes, is that the body supposed to represent the Muslims, the Muslim Faith Council, first its election is based on the area of the mosques. It's absurd. It's a completely absurd system. They measure the meter square of a mosque and say, okay, this mosque have like 10 votes, or you see how absurd it goes. And most and more absurd is that there is also the foundation for Islam of France, and this foundation has been created by a state decree and has the purpose of training clerics and educators about Muslim clerics, educators, and so on. Yep. It was created by the state, and it is its aim is to show how Islam can be connected with the philosophy of enlightenment and peace and tolerance and so on. And it's funded by private corporations, and the main funder is Serge Dassault. Dassault, which is a manufacturer of war planes and war missiles and rockets. And it is very symptomatic to see how far it goes and how absurd all this idea is. So to come back on what Jonas said, I think that what could have been Macron's trademark was that he at the beginning of his campaign for presidential elections, he branded himself kind of like a Clintonian figure, or a very kind of American figure, like identity politics liberal, okay? Which is something, because of the reasons that were explained, which was something kind of original in France. But during this campaign, he just gave up. He gave up on that because the backlash, the moment where he said things as identity politics liberal, and most famously, it was, and for France, it's still always crucial, when you said critical things about French colonization in Algeria. The backlash was immediate, and he slowly gave up on that to come back to the very comfort zone of the French bourgeoisie. And in fact, I think that Macron aims to have the extreme right as its main opponent, because he thinks that he can win against it, because he will have the votes like Biden had votes against Trump. That's the same logic. And in the meantime, it's not just this, it's not just a kind of political maneuver. There's also an aspect of conviction in that. In Macron's discourse, there's something which is kind of overlooked in the foreign press about how conservative some talking are, how conservatives are some talking points in Macron discourse. Macron said French people miss the king. We have to reintroduce the figure of the king, which is absurd and like conservative nonsense. But he genuinely repeats that, and he put very conservative figure. Like which would be once in the right wing of the Republican Party in the US or the right wing of the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom, in his government. The Interior Minister, Gérald Darmanin, who is the shock trooper of Islamophobia and so on, did demos against gay marriage. He was very vocal about it. The same thing for the Education Minister, Jean-Michel Blanquer. Those are really conservative figures. They don't come from like the liberal mainstream. And what is happening, the dynamic that's happening, particularly those last years, is that it's not only the nation. You must understand that the far-right discourse is not the monopoly of Le Pen or Le Pen's party. It's mostly aired by media outlets, particularly 24-hour like Fox News, like French Fox News, and press, which is totally insanely, it's going insane 24 hours per day, going very, very, very far right, and with the legitimization given by the government members who gave interviews. Just to give you a shocking example, the extreme right news, the extreme right magazine called Valeurs Actuelles depicted France Insoumise, so a left
Mélenchon's
MP,
party.
Mélenchon's party, depicted an MP who was called Danielle Obono, who is a black woman, depicted her in a caricature as a slave. Okay, that caused an outrage. Few weeks later, the minister for citizenship that exists in France gave an interview to this same magazine, so giving them again legitimacy. And in fact, so this extreme right discourse is like, okay, Muslims don't have their place here. They shut up or they go somewhere else. They don't have their place here. And Macron's discourse is not, that allows Macron to distantiate himself from this extreme right discourse, but still having an Islamophobic discourse. Macron's discourse is not Muslims must go somewhere else or they don't have their place here. He says, no, of course, Muslims belong to France. There is no problem. But the subtext is unless they don't have any critical political discourse, unless they don't have a political existence. If they are quiet, they are welcome. They are no problem. They can stay, they can live in France. And so that's the dynamic which is going on here, and it's the front of, as you said at the beginning, a major attack on civil liberties, on democratic rights, because there is this bill against the so-called separatism. But now there is also, and there was a major demonstration against it this Saturday, there is the global security bill, which for example, which has many things, and for example, which aims to forbid the airing of video footage of policemen. So, for example, for police violence, all the police violence cases are from this kind of video footage. It aims to forbid that. There is also an attack on the very old press law, which is a democratic law in France from 1881. There is now the idea of changing it, and so to control the statute of journalist. and in the meantime, and short enough about the attacks, Islamophobic attacks, the government decided also to dissolve some Muslim organizations, and they don't have any, in fact, they don't have like an organization called CCIF, which is an NGO giving legal aid against Islamophobia, which is really moderate and really legal team NGO.
In the US, it wouldn't be seen as it's completely normal. Yeah.
Yeah,
totally
totally.
mainstream.
And the government decided to dissolve it.
Yep.
And it's insane. And even the act of accusation is not even serious, because obviously they are talking about another organization. It's not even serious. But that's how far it has gone. This dynamic has gone.
David, can I just add something to that? I know we've talked. I don't mean to cut you off. I know we've talked a lot. I don't think people in the West get how terrible things have been. You know, on the one hand, there's this awful dynamic around these terrorist attacks, and then the anti-democratic response that Emre is describing, where literally they don't want you to share video of police, for example, right? So can you imagine in the United States if you couldn't share videos of police brutality if that was illegal? I think there's a way in which both some of the Islamist groups that kind of advocate these attacks, ISIS and the French right, want this kind of polarization, want things to be polarized around Muslims and the presence of Muslims. And then on the other hand, the level of repression and the debate about repression of kind of civil liberties, personal and religious freedoms is so over the top. You know, in 2003, when they banned students from wearing ostentatious religious symbols in schools, in public schools, you know, which basically it was a ban that began out of a controversy over two 13-year-old girls in a suburb in Aubervilliers, wasn't it, Emre? You know, who their teacher and the vice principal, like their principal, didn't want them in school because they're wearing the headscarf, right? So it's like, okay, cool, let's kick 13-year-old girls out of school for wearing the headscarf. Then by the late Sarkozy years, you have Marine Le Pen going around saying, well, we shouldn't have, there shouldn't be halal food restaurants. The halal restaurants have taken over. We need to serve pork in every school lunch. So, you know, or else the Islamists have won and defeated our secular values. When Muslims are praying, if you see like a Muslim taxi driver who prays in the street, it's just like the Nazi occupation. And now more recently, frankly, some of those positions they're not that far outside of the mainstream. The idea that there's a real problem with halal food, for example, is something that's come up again, you know, not just from the far right, but from people who are in or close to the government. So, you know, you see the progression of this debate that, again, to us in the United States, given the depths of racism here, you know, and official racism, this is, you know, it just seems bizarre and unthinkable. It's actually difficult for people to imagine the level of the debate that when a Muslim woman walks into a government building, the National Assembly, people from the ruling party get up and say, you can't be here because you're wearing a headscarf. That idea is, it's hard for people to digest, but it's true. That's the situation in France. And it only feels like this terrible polarization is going to intensify, right? You know, this debate around Islam and Muslims.
I think that is the danger, and you alluded there to, I mean, that polarization is being stoked up by various political actors with wider interests and perspectives in this. So much of the media coverage of what's going on in France has been repackaged as a conflict between the personalities of Macron in France and Erdogan in Turkey. Now, what you don't get in those news packages, what you're not told is that This is also about French and Turkish squabbles over the Eastern Mediterranean. This is also about geopolitics. It's a wider conflict. I mean, you're never told those sorts of things, of course. But, you know, it suits the interests of someone like Erdogan to present himself as the protector of Muslims and to project himself as, you know, the West as this Islamophobic sphere, and he's the protector, and Muslims should all rally around him and his wider political project. And it suits people like Macron to present Muslims as a threat to Western civilization, and you can see the reinforcing kind of tendencies there. Given that, how does the left best intervene into that polarization and try and break it down and create space for solidarity between communities?
First, you are totally right to emphasize this aspect, this dynamic between Macron and Erdogan. They're basically mirrors on this debate, and each one is motivated. First of all, I think even more, of course, geopolitical aspects, but even more in the national political crisis, because as Jonah said, Macron polls quite low since the beginning of his administration. In fact, Macron would dream about approval rating that Trump had. In the meantime, in Turkey, Erdogan's regime is increases because of economic contradictions, which are huge and disastrous. So one problem with that is that in fact, obviously, Erdogan can also seem like an appealing figure for parts in the Muslim proletariat in France. And the reason is, I think, and I go to your question, is the poor record of the left. In general, these last years, and about this issue in particular. One turning point about Islamophobia was what Jonah said, the law against ostentatious religious signs of 2004. And there was no real campaign against it from the left, even from the radical left. In fact, some organizations or some tendencies in the radical revolutionary left were in favor of this law because it will emancipate women by excluding them from school. A weird idea, but go figure. The fact is that, so this record is really poor, and there are some, it's going, like we can say that it's going a little bit better, but it's not enough. It's a little bit better because one major thing was last year, just 1 year ago, the 10 November 2019, there was a march against, a demonstration against Islamophobia. It was not launched by any left organization. But in the meantime, except the Socialist Party, the different organizations from the left participated to it, which was something. Since then, for example, Mélenchon's discourse about Islamophobia began, to be critical, and even he began to use the word Islamophobia, because in France there's even a debate about this word. Even in the left, that's Islamophobia is not, doesn't exist, and so on. But in general, and in so there are better things, and left organizations try slowly to act or to say it's going too far and so on. But it's still really not enough, and you need the push, the impulse of individuals or groups outside the left from Muslim background to have initiatives and to push the left to react and do things. And for example, just to illustrate, this Saturday there was, as I said, a kind of big demonstration against the global security bill, but there are not something like this or comparable to this, or a common reaction from left organizations about the dissolution of the CCIF, which is this legal aid, legal NGO that I told you, which is scandalous. There are some figures from left who say it's not normal and so on, but it's, you see the difference in the reactions, and that's a mistake because every time the democratic rights are broken, now it begins with the Muslims and then it goes larger. So to sum up, left about these issues, it mostly there are some discourse which are gaining traction in the left, but in terms of creating a space, like you said, it doesn't do much, and it has to be pushed.
Let me just add that I think in the past the left has it's been wrong-footed by some of the discourse of even the far right around questions of cultural integration. And in France in particular, laïcité is a complicated concept, and it has we already talked about some of the contradictions of it. On the one hand, the state is supposed to be neutral about religion. On the other hand, it means it's systematically intervening, right, to determine who is kind of officially recognized and on what grounds. But laïcité historically came out of the left, and the left's battle against clericalism and monarchism on the right. I mean, the 1905 law was a liberal left law that against the dominance of the Catholic Church, and they just had the Dreyfus affair where clericalism drove kind of anti-Semitism and reaction, and even into the 80s, the attempt to create a more secular school system was a battle primarily against the Catholic Church. So on the one hand, you have that, and then on the other hand, you have this complicated history around colonialism and racism that, of course, the left has been better on, but there definitely in France has not been, I would say, a coming to terms with that history that, as Emre said, even when Macron tried to bring up the Algeria war, it was a war to keep Algeria a colony where it killed how many people? 1 million, 1.5 million, 2 million? No one's quite sure. Where torture was widespread, where Algerian demonstrators in Paris, in 1961 famously were massacred, and their bodies, they were just drowned in the river, in the Seine River, right? And no one talked about it for decades afterwards. So there's this, there has not been a full grappling with that history. And I think, there's a lot to rethink there. And particularly now, as when even Marine Le Pen can say, on the one hand, Islamism is an attack on our Judeo-Christian values, and France is a Catholic country, and then on the other hand, she says, I'm defending laïcité and the rights of women against the left has really been thrown off by that discourse. And then there's also a larger question about what the left is capable of doing, and are we capable of offering a political alternative, an alternative political project to the far right? I would say in France, clearly the left is losing that battle. I mean, regions that traditionally were, strongholds for the left for decades and decades, now the far right has made major inroads in there. And it's not quite clear, what the left is doing. So on the one hand, there's this question specifically about this history around laïcité, around colonialism, around immigration. And then on the other hand, there's also the kind of wider question of what the hell is the left? What are we doing right now? And what's our project? What's our kind of grand strategy?
Okay, folks, thanks very much for that conversation. There's obviously loads more that could be said of of this, and including, I mean, I wouldn't want to leave people thinking that this is simply a French issue. I mean, this is also an argument that's broken out in Austria recently and other countries in Europe, and it's clearly going to spread. So I think it's an argument to watch and to continually kind of sharpen our analysis over. And I want to thank you, Jonah and Emery, for adding your thoughts on this. Thanks very much.
Hey, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And viewers can follow contour.co.uk, subscribe to this YouTube channel, subscribe to our SoundCloud channel to follow this issue and many others facing the left in Europe and the West and around the world. And I look forward to speaking to you all again soon.